Hello, friends. Today I want to talk about something that's very special to me. As I mentioned in my previous video regarding my 6 favorite games or most impactful games that mean a lot to me on the N64, I've mentioned that the #1 game of that entire list that's really important to me is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. If you want to hear the details of how I came across the game through my mom and dad, you can check that video out. But it was definitely a game that was impactful to me. You know, playing the game for the first time, like really getting to play for the first time, meeting the Deku Tree, which is obviously a really important character to me, considering the name of the channel. Going through the Deku Tree and then being tasked to essentially save Hyrule, that era of Hyrule. You know, you got the Emerald at the beginning, then you had to go seek the Ruby and the Sapphire. I remember leaving Kokiri Forest for the first time through the big tunnel, through the tree, crossing the bridge, and just seeing Hyrule Field just wide open. And, I had seen it before, seen my dad play it, but the controller was in my hand this time. And just knowing that I could go wherever I want to an extent. I just sat there, my controller in my hand, and I didn't move. I watched the sun move, the castle in the distance, the mountain in the distance. And it was just awe. And one of my favorite things about playing a game that is new to me is thinking about all of the potential that the game has to offer. And Ocarina of Time is my favorite piece when it came to this. It delivered on so many levels, and it was truly the first big game I really ever beat on my own. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there have been some leaks talking about a Legend of Zelda remake to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda series. And a part of me is extremely excited, and then there's another part of me that's just terrified. And I've sat with it for a while, and I want to go ahead and talk it through, wish lists, worries, all of that. The first thing I want to highlight is what will get added or cut from the remake in relation to the original and the remake of the 3DS version. There are things that were cut out that I think would be cool, like the Temple of Light that we never got to see. I would love to see Castletown just have a lot more life, maybe some more story, more sense of what Hyrule really used to be, as there's a lot of history there. And then future Hyrule deserves a lot more weight. 7 years have passed and the world fell apart. And the N64 did do a good job on several ways to showcase that, especially in Castletown. But I really want to see more of that and that negative impact that, Ganondorf kind of cast across the land in the future. And some of the things I don't want them to really do is to over streamline the puzzles. One of the things I loved about that game so much and still do to this day and would like to see more of is the complexity of the puzzles and how Zelda at that time had always introduced new concepts, new items typically to solve interesting puzzles in interesting ways. And I don't want them to streamline that. Yes, we all know the water temple's a righteous pain in the butt. And maybe there's a few ways they can improve it, but I don't want them to do too much and make it too easy. Also, I know this is going to be a little bit of a hot take, but we've got to keep Navi to be annoying. Like, she has to continue to say, hey, listen, because that's just the personality of what she was like. And just kind of the meme at this point, right? Maybe dial it back a little bit, but still make it where it's like, oh my gosh, will you please stop? I gotta keep it in there. If Navi's too chill or helpful, then it feels off. For those of us who have played the original. Again, silly hot take. Now, the next big question is, what is the style of this remake going to look like? Right, is it going to be dark and grounded and very serious like the Twilight Princess? Is it going to be Breath of the Wild, where it's much more soft, kind of feels like it's being painted? I really don't think it's going to be like the Wind Waker. If they go full cell shade on Ocarina of Time, I think a lot of people are going to be upset. To me, I would like for it to lean towards Twilight Princess, right? It's much more of a serious tone to this game. And I like the idea of that visual, maybe a little bit lighter, because Ocarina of Time is a little bit lighter in terms of style. The original kind of felt foreboding. And I want to make sure to kind of keep that feeling, especially that feeling of you need to go throughout Hyrule, and a lot of things are wrong being caused by this powerful individual. I want to keep it that way. And also in terms of style, there's a fear that they could make it too open world, right? And I would agree with that. I think that if you make it too open world, it kind of defeats some of the ideas of how Zelda games worked back then, where there's a lot that you can explore and find, but there are things that you run into where you're immediately limited because you need a special item. You know, there were only certain areas you could reach once you got the hook shot, or the bow and arrow, or the heavy boots. I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head. Right, there were areas of the world you simply could not access until you had got that item. So it kind of made it pseudo railroady, but I liked that. And also in terms of style, I don't want them to take away from things like the Shadow Temple. The Shadow Temple was very eerie, kind of bloody. There was some skulls and some creepy vibes, right? And I don't want them to take away from that, because each and every temple told a story through its design that I think needs to be kept, right? The Deku Tree, you were inside of the Deku Tree, just cleansing it of this rot, although it was too late, right? You were doing that, and then, you know, you were inside Jabu Jabu to save the princess, you were inside the mountain to calm it down. And so everything had a story and an intent behind it. And I don't want them to take away from that, right? Like, we're not asking for a museum piece here. We're just really asking for a feeling. It still needs to feel like Ocarina of Time, but with modern graphics. You know, there were aspects of the Final Fantasy VII Remake that it felt like Final Fantasy VII to an extent, like some of the characters and stuff, but at the same time, it felt like an entirely different game. And I don't want it to go that far with Ocarina of Time. And by the way, if you're enjoying this content that I'm making, you know, talking about, you know, my perspectives and stuff as an elder millennial, you know, I would love for you to subscribe, like the video, and then also comment, where do you land in terms of the art style debate? Do you have a strong opinion, or you're curious to see where it could go? I'm curious to see what you think. So let me know. The next thing I want to talk about is, will they remaster the music? And I think everybody's on the same page of, yes, remaster in a way that's still faithful to the music itself and doesn't change it. This is something that I think the Final Fantasy VII Remake did a great job of with Nobuo Uematsu's music. And I really want to make sure that, you know, all these pieces stay the same, especially because this game really revolves around an important piece of gear that is music themed, right? This game is called the Ocarina of Time. You know, it is a magical ocarina that has a lot of power behind it, you know, handed down through Princess Zelda's family. And so I definitely want to make sure that they keep that and that they don't change too much. Maybe they can add some new songs, you know, if they add a new area or two that's not significantly, drastically changing things, that I think that would be really cool. My next question I have to ask myself is, will they preserve the atmosphere? You know, this kind of goes into the styling that we talked about earlier. You know, again, we're talking about the idea of the potential of, you know, leaving the first area and seeing the Hyrule Fields for the first time, and just, again, thinking about that potential and, you know, the different designs that we would see with different creatures, you know, Dead Hand, the Shadow Temple, Bongo Bongo, you know, the things that really scared people because that was the intent behind that story, or the Forest Temple and the creepy paintings with the Phantom of Ganon, you know, and all those different things to think about. I really want to make sure they keep that there. I hope that's preserved in some way. You know, and I like the idea that it'll have more modern graphics, but I don't think it needs to be overly polished. I think like having modern lighting, you know, just having something that feels more lived in, more trees, more grass and those kinds of things, just to add more detail. But again, not to take away from the overall feelings. The last thing I want to ask, and a question I think to myself is, this is the sole question of this whole thing to me, is, are they remaking the game we played or the game we remember? Because those are two completely different things. You know, I have nostalgia goggles that just purely thinks of the story, the adventure, seeking the Goron sword, the unbreakable, you know, claymore, basically. And just the moment that it meant to me as a kid, you know, playing this game for the first time, and how much that meant to me going forward and how it sticks with me today. But I have also recently tried playing it again on my Switch, and the controls are clunky because it was, you know, this was a game designed for a controller that only had one joystick, right? So there are aspects of it that felt slow. You know, you had to use Z targeting because that's how you were able to talk to people. So, you know, there's different areas where, you know, how can they combine it in such a way where it's modernized, where it leans more into it playing like we remember it, and without taking too much away. And so overall, you have to ask yourself, which one does Nintendo make, right? And to me, I would love for them to make the one that we remember when we recall this game. There's so many games out there that we grow up and we play and we have an amazing memory of it. And then when we go back and play it again, sometimes it's not what we will remember. And it's, a little bit more difficult, or maybe some other factors that come into play when you're playing a game that you remember. And then sometimes the mechanics stick. There's several games where I'll go back and it feels like I remember it right away. So, that's my wish list and worries and where I'm at with the remake. Again, Ocarina of Time is my favorite game of all time. So this one really means a lot to me and has really made me think about what could happen with a remake. Again, let me know what you think about the art style in the comments. And until I see you in the next video, I hope that you have a blessed day.